Thank you. So today's presentation will focus on providing an overview of the CNSC and on the project and licensing approval process. We'll then present the results of the CNSC staff assessment of OPG's licensed construct application and of the future outreach and engagement activities for the project. Next slide, please. I'll begin by explaining who the CNSC is, what our mandate is, who our tribunal is, and also our responsibilities as a regulator. I'll also cover the licensee responsibilities, OPG in this case. Next slide. So the CNSC is the sole authority in Canada for regulating the development, production, and use of nuclear energy, as well as the production, possession, and use of nuclear substances, prescribed equipment, and information. The CNSC's mandate builds on 3 pillars. The first is to regulate the use of nuclear energy and materials to protect the health, safety, security, and environment for Canadians. The second is to implement Canada's international commitments on the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And the third pillar is somewhat unique for Canadian regulators or government agencies and departments. And that's our mandate to disseminate objective scientific, technical, and regulatory information to the general public and Indigenous nations and communities. Outreach activities such as today's webinar are at the core of our daily work. Finally, the promotion of nuclear activities is not part of the CNSC's mandate, but it is our job to safely regulate them. Next slide. Decisions to grant a license are made by an independent commission at arm's length from government and is made up of a panel of experts. The commission includes up to 7 members at any given time, and they are appointed by the Governing Council based on their qualifications and expertise. You can see on the slide the current members of the commission. The commission decisions are transparent and guided by clear rules of procedure. Interested parties and members of the public are able to participate in public commission hearings, which are also webcasted live. They are often held in facility host communities to make them as accessible as possible to local residents. The commission provides extensive rationales for its decisions, which are based on information and evidence that includes public input as well as the recommendations of expert CNSC staff. Decisions, hearing transcripts, webcast archives, and other documentation are publicly available on the CNSC's website. The commission is supported by more than 800 scientific, technical, and professional staff. These employees review applications for licenses according to regulatory requirements and make recommendations to the commission. I'd also like to mention that the CNSC will have a new president starting next month. Mr. Pierre Tremblay has been appointed as our president for the next 5 years. Next slide. CNSC staff work in various functions to fulfill this important role of making recommendations to the commission and to support their decision-making. CNSC staff have backgrounds ranging from nuclear science and engineering to Indigenous consultation and are experts in their fields. Staff are responsible for implementing commission decisions, developing regulatory requirements and guidance for commission approval, verifying and enforcing compliance with regulatory requirements, and of course, as we're doing right now, engaging with the public and Indigenous nation and communities through various outreach programs. Next slide, please. As a regulator, the CNSC is responsible for establishing a licensing and compliance system to ensure that all persons who use or possess nuclear substances and radiation devices do so in accordance with the license. The CNSC also ensures that regulated parties have safety and security provisions in place that comply with regulatory requirements. As for licensees, as OPG, they are directly responsible for managing regulated activities in a manner that protects the health, safety, security, and the environment, and that conforms with Canada's domestic and international obligations on the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Through this licensing and compliance system, the CNSC ensures that regulated parties are informed about regulatory requirements and have the proper guidance on how to meet them. When doing all of this, the CNSC makes independent, objective, and risk-informed decisions. I will now pass the presentation to my colleague, Bartek. Next slide, please.
Excellent. Thank you, Manon. So my name is Bartek Rezenkowski, and I am a Senior Project Officer for the Advanced Reactors Licensing Division at the CNSC. Now we'll provide an overview of the Darlington New Nuclear Project, including information on the project background and the licensing process and hearing approach for the license application that OPG submitted to the CNSC. Next slide, please. The OPG Darlington New Nuclear Project is for the construction and operation of up to 4 new nuclear reactors at the existing Darlington site in the municipality of Clarington. The environmental assessment for this project began in 2006 when OPG applied for a license to prepare a site to build up to 4 new nuclear reactors at the Darlington site, and an environmental assessment commenced under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and was completed in 2012. In December 2021, OPG selected the GE Hitachi BWX-300 reactor technology. The selection of a reactor technology required OPG to demonstrate that its chosen technology fits within the bounds of the environmental assessment previously completed. This was subject to the January 2024 Commission or public hearing that was held, and the Commission determined that the selected technology fits within the bounds of the existing environmental assessment. With this record of decision, the CNSC is proceeding with a public hearing on the LTC application to construct 1 BWX-300 unit that was submitted by OPG back in October of 2022. Next slide, please. To explain where we are with this project, this slide depicts an overview of the DNP licensing process and what has transpired to date. The DNP licensing process began in October 2022 when OPG submitted its application for a license to construct a reactor facility. As required by our legislation, this application triggered the need for both an environmental review and technical assessment. The environmental review was the subject of the January 2024 public hearing on the applicability of the DNP environmental assessment to the BWX-300 reactor technology. For the technical assessment, CNSC staff reviewed OPG's application in the context of the Nuclear Safety and Control Act and relevant regulations that apply to the activities in the application. The results of the regulatory review is provided in the Commission member document, often referred to as the CMD, which includes CNSC staff recommendations to the Commission as well. As an agent of the Crown, the CNSC is committed to upholding the honor of the Crown and fulfilling its duty to consult and, where appropriate, accommodate for decisions and activities that could potentially impact the exercise of Indigenous and/or treaty rights. CNSC staff have aimed to conduct a flexible and collaborative consultation process for the OPG DNP license to construct application to date. CNSC staff will continue to consult with Indigenous nations and communities in advance of the Part 2 hearing, with the goal of striving to achieve a consensus and resolution for any outstanding issues or concerns related to the OPG DNP license to construct application. The Commission will review the CNSC staff's CMD and any supplementary materials and documents and make a decision on the application through a public hearing process. The public hearing gives Indigenous nations and communities, interested stakeholders, and members of the public an opportunity to be heard before the Commission. There will be a two-part hearing for this project. Part 1 will take place on October the 2nd of 2024, and Part 2 will take place starting January 8th of 2025. Should the Commission decide to issue OPG a license to construct, CNSC staff will conduct regulatory oversight via a well-established compliance verification plan. During this licensing process, there are ongoing engagement of the public in consultation with Indigenous nations and communities. Next slide, please. A CNSC staff CMD was developed, which documents CNSC staff's review of the application as well as the conclusions and recommendations of the regulatory review to date. This CMD is publicly available on the CNSC website, and interventions are due to the Commission Registry by November 4th of 2024. This slide summarizes the two-part hearing focus for the project. Part 1 is to focus on the CNSC staff approach to a first-of-a-kind reactor and the results of the regulatory review of OPG's license to construct application. It will be a virtual hearing with no interventions in Part 1. Part 2 will be the focus on interventions received and any follow-up requested by the Commission from Part 1. It will be held in the community with a hybrid option for those who cannot attend in person. Next slide, please. 3 stages of participant funding were offered for this phase of the project under the Participant Funding Program, or often referred to as the PFP. The purpose of the PFP is to provide financial assistance to enable interested members of the public, Indigenous nations and communities, or other individuals to become more involved in regulatory activities and in the Commission proceeding process. The first 2 PFP stages were related to OPG's plant parameter envelope and environmental impact statement submissions and the January 2024 hearing that was held and are not included in the scope of this proceeding. The third stage of PFP is for the involvement in the process for upcoming 2-part hearing process. The CNSC awarded over $119,000 in funding to 11 applicants. The financial support may be used for helping to submit interventions for Part 2 of the hearing. Those interventions are due November 4th of 2024. Next slide, please. So far, we've given an overview of the project, the licensing process, and hearing approach for the DNP. Now we'll go into the CNSC staff Commission member document and focus specifically on staff's conclusions and recommendations to the Commission. Next slide, please. Commission member document 24-H3 documents key aspects of the CNSC staff review and technical assessment, as well as provides CNSC staff conclusions and recommendations to the Commission regarding OPG's application for the construction of a single BWRX 300 reactor unit at the DNP site. A summary of Indigenous consultation activities is also provided in the CMD, and detailed information is provided in the CNSC staff Indigenous consultation report accompanying the CMD. CNSC staff assessment considered OPG's construction license application and supporting technical documentation, new and existing programs, processes, and procedures as applicable to the proposed DNP construction, and the public information, community outreach, and Indigenous engagement activities. Next slide, please. CNSC staff have determined that OPG has provided sufficient information to support a recommendation that the Commission issue a license to construct. As outlined in the proposed construction license and the draft license condition handbook, there are several areas where OPG will be required to provide additional information. In order to provide additional time to collaborate and consult with Indigenous nations and communities, CNSC staff will be submitting a supplemental report to the Commission in advance of the Part 2 hearing. This supplemental submission will include an update on consultation activities, rights impact assessments, and CNSC staff conclusions and recommendations with regards to the duty to consult and, where appropriate, accommodate. In consideration of all aspects of the CNSC staff review, including based on OPG's existing and newly proposed programs applicable to the DNP, CNSC staff have determined that the DNP will provide for the adequate protection of people and the environment as recommended in the proposed license, with conditions and draft license condition handbook. Next slide, please. So one thing that we want to mention is that should a construction license be issued by the Commission, there will be no nuclear material on the DNP site, as this was not requested in the OPG license to construct application, and the proposed license does not permit nuclear material. As part of the CNSC staff conclusion, the proposed license includes 3 site-specific license conditions, including the proposal of 3 regulatory hold points at specific project milestones. As documented in the CMD, the proposed regulatory hold points are as follows. RHP1 is for the installation of reactor building foundation. So this would authorize OPG to place the foundation base mat for the reactor building and commence civil construction of the reactor building structure. RHP2, this is for the installation of the reactor pressure vessel. This would authorize OPG to install the reactor pressure vessel and associated structures and components. The reactor pressure vessel is a vertical cylindrical pressure vessel used to contain the reactor core, coolant, and associated systems and components in a boiler water reactor. And RHP-3, so this is for fuel out commissioning. So this would authorize OPG to conduct a full-scale testing and commissioning of installed structure, systems, and components. No fuel involved. So effectively, it constitutes the set of structure, systems, and component testing requirements prior to loading nuclear fuel into the reactor core. In order for a regulatory hold point to be released, OPG will be required to submit evidence that all commitments related to that regulatory hold point had been completed. Further criteria for CNSC staff to recommend the release of a regulatory hold point is provided in the draft license condition handbook. The use of these regulatory hold points permits phased construction while ensuring conditions set out in the license have been satisfied at key milestones before proceeding with licensed activities. Next slide, please. So far, we've provided a brief overview of the state of the project and provided an overview of CNSC staff CMD conclusion and recommendation. For the full details of CNSC staff assessment, the CMD is now accessible on the CNSC's website. Looking ahead, we'd like to share a holistic calendar of all future events related to the project. Next slide, please. So this is the schedule of events for the DNP, and it includes some dates we've mentioned in previous slides. We have this webinar today presenting an update on the OPG LTC application regulatory review. The CNSC staff CMD 24-H3 is available on the Commission webpage. Part 1 hearing to be held virtually on October the 2nd. Interventions are due November 4th, and Part 2 hearing to be held in the community with the hybrid option starting on January 8th. Next slide, please. With that, this concludes our presentation. I'll pass it back to my colleague, Manon. Thank you.